At the Battle of Waterloo, French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte suffers his final defeat, and 2 decades of war in Europe come to an end. The victorious powers, led by Austria, Britain, Prussia, and Russia, meet at Vienna to decide the fate of Europe. The frontiers of nations and empires are redrawn, while Emperor Alexander of Russia adds King of Poland to his list of titles. He also oversees creation of a holy alliance to ensure that no more revolutions threaten Europe's established order. The Russian Empire, after many great sacrifices in the wars against Napoleon, emerges more powerful than ever. But not everyone in Russia is pleased with the new state of affairs. A group of young army officers dream of a different future for Russia, a new form. It was a defining moment in his reign. But he underestimated Russian resolve. For months later, the remnants of his army began its infamous retreat from Moscow. Napoleon's abdication was a moment of triumph for Emperor Alexander and for Russia. For many young Russian officers, it was also an eye-opening experience. Imperial Russia was an autocracy, ruled by an emperor with no checks upon his power. There was no political opposition or constitution. There was no freedom of speech or right to trial. Approximately 80% of Russians were serfs, peasants with no rights, freedom, or hope of betterment, their status passed down to their children. The inefficiency, not to mention injustice, of such a system was increasingly apparent even to many Russian aristocrats. In Europe, serving as officers in the Russian army, they'd visited countries where serfdom had been swept aside by war and revolution, and where monarchs had granted constitutions that limited their power, protected freedoms, and acknowledged the rule of law. Many were inspired and began to dream of similar reforms in Russia, but few placed faith in Emperor Alexander to aid their cause. On the night of March 11, 1801, Alexander's father, Emperor Paul, was strangled to death by a group of disaffected army officers. Alexander succeeded to the throne aged just 23. The ineffectiveness and chaos of his father's rule had appalled him. In 1797 he'd written to his tutor, "To speak plainly, the well-being of the state is not at all considered in the administration of affairs. There is only absolute power, which does everything wrong and at cross purposes. The choice of officials is entirely a matter of favoritism. Merit counts for nothing. The farmer is plagued. Commerce is hindered. Personal liberty and well-being are reduced to nothing." There you have the picture of Russia. Judge how my heart must suffer. The young Alexander displayed a great enthusiasm for reform, an encouraging sign to Russian aristocrats who wished to see a more modern Russian state. In 1803, he passed a decree that gave landowners the right to free their serfs. Many hoped it was a first step towards the abolition of serfdom. In 1808, the brilliant and liberal-minded Mikhail Speransky became Alexander's chief advisor. He created a new council of state to advise the emperor, and even began working on a Russian constitution. But in 1812, Alexander's appetite for reform ended abruptly. First, an anti-reform faction, led by the emperor's sister Grand Duchess Ekaterina Pavlovna, engineered Speransky's dismissal. Then, Napoleon invaded Russia. In this moment of supreme crisis, Alexander was seized by religious fervor, a sense of personal mission and national destiny. The burning of Moscow, he declared, had illuminated his soul. Liberal reforms, he could now see, were only the road to anarchy and chaos. They were an intolerable risk to Russia's holy institutions. In 1815, any officers returning from Europe harboring hopes of reform were to be severely disappointed. Alexander added insult to injury by granting a liberal constitution not to Russia, but to his new kingdom, Poland, not one it turned out he planned to honor. 3 years later, when Alexander raised the possibility of a Russian constitution based on this Polish experiment, it proved an empty promise. Idealistic young officers, more alienated than ever, decided that if the emperor would not take up their cause, they must act themselves. They began to organize secret societies and to plan a revolution. Many Russian military officers already belonged to a secret society. Freemasonry had been imported from Europe in the 18th century and was popular among army officers. But in 1816, officers from Russia's prestigious Guards regiments, based in St. Petersburg, formed a new secret society, the Union of Salvation. 4 of its founding members would play a leading role in a revolutionary movement that became known as the Decembrists. Nikita Muravyov, a captain in the Guards division staff, aged 31 at the time of the Decembrist revolt. He would draft one of their major plans for constitutional reform. Lieutenant Colonel Sergei Muravyov Apostle, aged 30 at the time of the revolt. He would lead the Decembrist uprising in Ukraine. Colonel Prince Sergei Trubetskoy, aged 36 at the time of the revolt. A war hero from one of Russia's most distinguished families, Trubetskoy would be chosen to lead the Decembrist coup in St. Petersburg. And Colonel Pavel Pastel of the Vyatka Infantry Regiment, aged 33 at the time of the revolt. Also a decorated war hero, badly wounded at Borodino. He was a brilliant if uncompromising officer and one of the most active and radical members of the Union. He would argue for the emperor's death and creation of a Russian republic. The Union of Salvation soon merged with another secret society, the Order of Russian Knights, to form the Union of Prosperity, with more than 200 members. Its charter, known as the Green Book, set out how the Union was to be organized. It also spelled out its commitment to educating the public about Enlightenment ideals of virtuous, moral citizenship. This, it was hoped, would generate wider support for reform among Russia's elite. Only a trusted inner circle was privy to the Union's more radical, long-term goals of securing a constitution and ending serfdom. The leaders of the Union of Prosperity were wise to be wary.